Hello, Animals Alliance Asia. I am thrilled to be with you today. My name is Dr. Krista Hiddema. I'm located in Canada. I am the executive director of For the Greater Good. And in that capacity, I have the opportunity to work with animal protection organizations across the world on organizational development, strategic planning, and board governance. My doctorate is in the area of social sciences. I am a ecofeminist academic. And as such, I was very interested in studying the lived experiences of women in our movement, particularly those who are employed. And while our volunteers are such an important part of our movement, as vocational activists, or as folks where this is their job, it is a little bit of a different relationship with the organization. So I had the opportunity to work with women in Canada and the United States, and I'm excited to share some of what I learned with you, share some of their recommendations, and then workshop with you a little bit later today on how some of that might be relevant for you in your country. I spent a number of years in the for-profit sector, and although I had been vegan for several decades, I hadn't yet worked in the movement. So when I did join the movement a little over 10 years ago, it was really a dream come true for me. The part that didn't feel like a dream come true, however, was really learning about the lack of human resources practices and really seeing women with high rates of burnout and high rates of turnover. So as an academic, the first thing I did was turn to the literature. And there is some very interesting papers in the area of social movements and how burnout and how turnover can impact those movements. And in particular, one very interesting paper was called "Nobody's Paying Me to Cry." And it was specifically about activists in the United States. And the paper really summarized by saying that the turnover and the burnout in our movement is one of the biggest threats to the stability of our movement. And it was really through reading these papers that inspired me to decide to go back to school to do my doctorate. I wanted to spend some time really looking at organizational governance in our movement, and I wanted to do it in such a way that centered the stories of women. And as story-based researchers, it really is a very feminist form of research. So the research that we do as feminists tends to be what we call qualitative research, which means that we are interested in words, we're interested in stories, and we're interested in spending significant time with our participants. So in my case, I spent many hours with each of the women where I did a lot of listening. The other kind of research is what we call quantitative. And that's when we look at the big numbers, and people usually are filling out a survey where they're saying, on a scale of 1 to 10, how did you feel about this? Well, what we do instead as feminist researchers, again, is really spending time understanding in a deeper way. And in my case, I worked with 33 women. They ranged in age from 23 to 60. They had been in the farmed animal advocacy movement for between 1 and 15 years. 10 of the women had children, 8 identified as BIPOC, 8 as LGBTQ, and 4 were living with a disability. The educational levels rather of the women ranged from high school to 4 women with doctorates. The marital status also ranged. 3 were in Canada, 30 in the US, and in total, the women talked about 72 different organizations in our movement. So in essence, what I wanted to hear from the women was whether the principles of care that we are asking members of the general public to apply to animals, are those principles of care applied to the women activists themselves? And further, I wanted them to share with me their suggestions for how the movement might become more healthy. So I asked them questions about practices, policies, and governance recommendations to make our workplaces healthy in our movement. While many of the experiences and the stories were negative, and we'll get to those in just a minute, there were some positive stories. The positive stories, however, really were exclusively stories that occurred in the first little bit of employment. So it's sometimes what we call the honeymoon period. One of the women said that she had stars in her eyes, but then the bubble burst quickly. Another mentioned feeling like she was on cloud nine for the first few months. And another came into the movement saying, I was willing to deal with the men, the low pay, knowing that she would be able to contribute to work to help animals. Generally, however, a lot of the stories were quite negative. One person summed it up by saying, I was very aware of the harassment, compassion fatigue, burnout, and sexual harassment. And this woman said, I was aware that it was a key issue preventing us from moving forward. Another woman who was a manager said, I will forever feel that I let them down. And she was referring to the staff that worked for her, because she became paralyzed by her own hero worship towards her manager, who had been acting inappropriately towards her employees. Another woman said, the whole essence of the workplace is just disempowering and toxic. It's a culture of bullying. And yet another woman said that she was legitimately concerned for her safety and well-being during the Me Too uprising, because her manager had threatened people in the past, and because he'd been violent to other people in the past. Somebody else shared that she went to the HR department, the human resources department, and told them that she was experiencing racism, yet nothing was done. So a theme that I heard from many of the women was that there were few human resources policies and practices. There was little by way of transparency regarding pay and benefits. The turnover was high, and there was a significant lack of recognition, diversity, fairness, respect, and a significant lack of professionalism. And one woman said, I don't think we're acting out of our vegan ethics when we betray human animals for non-human animals. Fortunately, the women all shared stories also of hope, and they talked about their recommendations that they felt would really make a significant difference in our movement. After listening to their many recommendations, I was able to distill the recommendations down into, in essence, a one-page checklist. And that checklist is in your handouts for our workshop. The recommendations included recommendations for the farmed animal advocacy movement overall, recommendations for funders, recommendations importantly for boards of directors, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. There were recommendations for the organizations overall and for leaders within the organizations. I said we were going to come back to boards of directors, and the reason for this is because everything to do with organizations begins with the board. As a nonprofit organization in both Canada and the United States, as well As a nonprofit in many, if not most other countries, including Asian countries, you are required by law to be governed by an independent and volunteer board of directors. And our movement is no exception to this. So from a legal perspective, boards have the ultimate accountability, authority, and responsibility for the organization. Boards should be our go-to when we have a challenge. Unfortunately, one woman shared with me that she was having a challenge with a funder, and she went to her board member. She described this funder as kissing her on the cheek and engaging in lingering hugs. So those hugs lasted a little longer than they should have. She shared this with her board member. And unfortunately, her board member's response to her was, "He's an old man. That's just what he does." Boards are responsible for all aspects of the organization, including and importantly, the people. That kind of response is so inappropriate and so upsetting. Many times boards feel that their primary responsibility is money, but that's not necessarily true. Their primary responsibility is for the people who really are the ones that are doing the hard work for animals. And we know that organizations that don't take care of their people, that don't retain their activists, are likely to create long-term change. Because as those organizations recede, as they lose people, those organizations can easily unravel and they can become easy to forget. And in our movement, this research overall is a plea to all movement stakeholders, primarily boards of directors, to start prioritizing the health of these organizations. And it must begin with an ecofeminist approach of using care when considering organizational practices, policies, and governance, and understanding that when we do that, it is always, always for the animals.